"20 years ago, at the height of the dance remix and rave scene, Alex Rogopoulos, Aaron Agozi, Mike Dornbrook, and their talented team of musician developers at Harmonix crossed boundaries with a new way to experience music on a game console. Before they connected with rock legends to allow us to experience the Beatles like never before they turned into a $150 million company and were acquired by Viacom and then Epic, before Rock Band and Guitar Hero broke revenue records by putting guitar controllers and drumsticks in gamers' hands all over the world, Harmonix made their first console game for the PlayStation 2. Frequency started it all. Hi, I'm Tim Ryan. I had joined Sony's online studios in 2000 to make an online service for their first venture into internet multiplayer games. I produced the pack-in setup disc for the PlayStation's network adapter and this, Sony's first online game. Frequency was Vice President Shohei Yoshida's pet project, his first attempt to bring music rhythm games popular in Japan to the US market. Sales of such games in the US were dismal to date. I inherited the project as its producer. This innovative game was no surprise, behind schedule, and very rough. When I first looked at Frequency with its abstract interface and cyberspace landscape, I didn't know what to make of it. Let's hear how my 30-year-old self described it.
Frequency is a revolutionary rhythm music game that will convert gamers into musicians and probably a lot of musicians into gamers. The gameplay in Frequency is like Tempest meets Dance Revolution, where you're actually traveling down a tunnel of music and you choose a particular track to play, which is a particular instrument like drum, bass, voice, guitar, and you have to press the buttons to the rhythm of that particular track to complete that track.
Man, I really rocked that mustache. Anyway, I must have practiced that elevator pitch for hours, and if that sounded confusing, imagine trying to market it. Let's just take a look. Frequency had this trippy, rotating tunnel track set inside a retro cyberspace world. Splash this on a projector screen at one of those roaming raves south of Market to an audience dosed up on ketamine and ecstasy, you'll absolutely dazzle them. We actually did. Frequency was played with only 3 buttons and a directional pad. We didn't have a guitar or keyboard controller. The traditional grip, hitting the 3 face buttons with your thumb, was too slow. Flipping your right hand over for a 3-finger approach played faster, but it was awkward. And then using the 3 of the 4 shoulder buttons, rarely used but for alternative actions on games, was actually the fastest. We weren't sure the shoulder buttons were actually designed to handle that kind of constant button mashing, but it really was the only way to play Frequency effectively, especially at the hardest levels. But no matter what way you played, using your gamepad like a musical instrument was awkward. When I first played it, Frequency was extremely hard to play. It seemed to be designed by musicians for musicians. And QA kept breaking controllers, not because of the shoulder buttons or anything like that, but because they were literally smashing their controllers on the ground in frustration. When you lost a level, sometimes after 9 or 10 attempts, the game actually booed at you to rub it in. Anyway, I cycled a group of testers with no prior experience on Frequency in through the test pit, and I captured how many attempts they took to pass a level and how far they got. I had them try the 3 control schemes, the shoulder buttons, the 3-finger, and thumb only. And only one tester was able to actually complete the whole game on hardest with thumb only. Nicknamed Golden Boy, we later put him up against the Harmonix developers in a friendly online multiplayer competition. And when he won, I bought Golden Boy a case of Michelob Gold. At any rate, I provided Harmonix with the difficulty test report, and they smoothed out the difficulty curve by rearranging the order of songs, loosened up the button timing, and adjusted some of the song's gem patterns to make them easier to play. As I mentioned, the game was behind schedule, but not because of Harmonix, but because of the music licensing. First, there was a disagreement between the previous producer, marketing, and the game's music director, Chuck Dowd, about the music genre. Was it to be only techno and trance, or should it reach out to a broader audience with maybe some rap, rock, and maybe some drum and bass? We ended up settling on a mix which should have allowed the licensing to continue, but then the challenge was the nature of the licensing. This was the first game where the elements from the recording session were licensed, not just the song, because we needed that to be able to remix the song. Artists were rightfully hesitant. Could players redistribute these remixes? Could they steal the samples off the disc? Or in the case of one rap artist, will they actually have the right to censor a song that they themselves sampled for their composition? What we could describe over the phone was also too confusing. To get artists to appreciate this big ask, we had to demo the prototype in person using some of Harmonix in-house music. But all of our difficulties in convincing artists went away when world-famous DJ, remix artist, and Grammy winner Paul Oakenfold signed on. Once he did, the other artists saw the potential. Acts such as the Crystal Method, No Doubt, Orbital, Curve, and the Dub Pistols gave us the recording sessions and sometimes custom mixes to accommodate our remix mode and game mechanics. No Doubt's Ex-Girlfriend, with its ska-inspired rhythm and tempo changes, had to be remixed. That cost us some extra dough, but it was worth it. Alex, Ron, and Mike knew they were onto something, and they filed for several patents for their design. This was a pretty smart move to protect their IP from another developer or publisher, or even Sony, from copying their game mechanics. Of concern were several Japanese game developers who had kick-started the rhythm music genre with such hits as Parappa the Rapper, Dance Dance Revolution, and Rez, which were much more popular in Japan. Oddly, when we presented Sony Japan the option of a Japanese version of Frequency, they turned us down. They said their audience would want to hear the whole song, not hear it pieced together as part of the gameplay. So they didn't like the whole concept that made it innovative, and Shu Yoshida didn't get a chance to show his former colleagues in Japan what a US team could do for the genre. Marketing Frequency was its own challenge because the genre literally didn't exist on our website or stores. Frequency was put in the puzzle category with Tetris. As abstract and as different as it was, I guess you just had to sit down and play it to appreciate it. Now, marketing didn't tell product development what to do, and vice versa. And we saw some odd attempts to reach an audience that didn't yet exist in the US. I remember they put a 2-page spread in Rolling Stone magazine, and I bought it and brought it home to the wife, and she flipped through it twice, and she couldn't find the ad. I had to show it to her. It was a picture of a black stereo rack system with a little PlayStation and Frequency logo in the bottom corner. I don't know what they were thinking. Then came the commercials. As luck would have it, Frequency was the only first-party game to actually ship on time that year. The rest of the games slipped past Christmas, and we suddenly had holiday season television spots already paid for because Twisted Metal, SOCOM, and Gran Turismo had all slipped. Now, having Gold Mastered 2 weeks early, I was enjoying an extended holiday vacation when those two ads aired. And here's one the ad agency produced, inspired, I would guess, by South Park or maybe Ren and Stimpy. Oh man. I had an arrangement with a friend at Electronic Arts to exchange employee discounts on games, and I remember him calling me that Christmas and he asked me for that Worm game, and I'm like, yeah, well, that's my game. He said, wait, you're working on a Worm game? Anyway, I don't know what worms and lawnmowers have to do with music, but there you had what was essentially a teaser ad with about 2 seconds of gameplay footage at the very end. Now, what follows is a much cooler abstract commercial that played up the game's remix mode.
1, 2, 3, 4.
While that was interesting, it didn't have anything to do with music. So this was the problem of trying to market an abstract game that you just had to sit down and play to understand. Now, in hindsight, they should have just featured some reviews, which were awesome, so players could actually hear from people who actually sat down to play it. We marketed Frequency at clubs and concerts, and we had this idea of making a demo disc also playable in a CD player. So I burned the demo and a few song tracks on a mixed data and music CD, and I sent it off to Format QA for approval, something all PlayStation games and demo discs are required to pass. And they initially rejected it, citing the extra music files on the disc. Apparently, someone had slipped an MPEG of South Park as filler on a game disc once, and they were determined not to make that mistake again. Anyway, after explaining the extra files were intentional, we submitted it to manufacturing. This was the first time we actually tried this, and we weren't sure the songs would actually survive the encryption process. So we ran a $3,000 minimum run experiment, and it worked. You could put that disc in your PS2 to play the game, or you could put it into your CD player to listen to the songs. We ordered thousands and handed them out at clubs and stores around the US. That single disc, playable in both a CD player and PS2, embodied what Frequency was trying to do: bridge two mediums. Then, unfortunately, the marketing dried up. Apparently, someone had shot a Gran Turismo commercial which featured a race through traffic and wrecked cars, and no one in marketing or legal thought to get, legal clearance from the auto manufacturers. So anyway, they had to reshoot, and to pay for it, they robbed our budget. As I said, Frequency was the first online game for Sony. Xbox was online already with a basic service and multiplayer game servers. Sony needed to catch up, and while still years away, the PS3 would eventually launch with an online service built in. For the PS2, we had this aftermarket adapter that you can plug into the back. It had both an Ethernet port for broadband and a phone jack for dial-up, as well as an optional hard drive. I produced the pack and setup disk to make it work with your internet service provider. Now, to get online faster, Sony had purchased a game server technology company called MPlayer to help get us online. They provided matchmaking and game server code, and they were also notoriously late, and poor Harmonix was on the bleeding edge of their online SDK, which was constantly changing its API. I ended up sending a copy of Frequency source code with Harmonix's blessing to the MPlayer engineers, and I forced them to compile Frequency with every update of the SDK just to make sure it still worked. Sony had never actually tested online games before. We were not our sister company SOE that produced EverQuest. I had to explain to QA that every time I got them a new version to test, it would include two disks, one for server and one for the game. I also orchestrated the separation of production QA and development stacks so that releases could be properly isolated, tested, staged, and deployed. And then I wrote the first online test requirements, since apparently QA didn't have any of those either. And then someone in Format QA kind of did a dick move, and they published those same requirements as their own document and demanded I comply with them. Well, given as I wrote those documents originally, we passed that testing. There were other ramifications for being online that Sony just wasn't prepared for. Sony's legal got really nervous when we approached them about an end-user license agreement on the setup disk. They didn't understand the ramifications of being online and subjected to player behavior. We had an IRC chat on the setup disk. It was sort of a minimal nod to the online service we were working on. So of course, the day my boss was demoing IRC chat to the lawyers and execs, disaster struck. We had just implemented a vulgarity filter, and like all gamers, our testers took the vulgarity filter as a challenge. They found creative spellings in order to swear, and they were in the thick of vulgar trash talking while the demo to the execs and lawyers was going on. Anyway, my boss told them this was a perfect example of why we needed the EULA. Well, instead, the lawyers pulled the plug on our chat. Sony just wasn't ready for it. Then they added months of development onto MPlayer, which was already behind, to develop a new, supposedly better vulgarity filter for the games. At any rate, Frequency itself was not without its controversy. Our game had customized avatars where you could construct your freak with simple shapes and set the colors. Besides making copyrighted characters like Cookie Monster and Batman, they can make pornographic images. This was our own QA, mind you, the same group that tested the vulgarity filter. Anyway, this was all just a slice of the internet culture we were about to be exposed to. So we ended up actually having to remove the flesh tones from the palette rather than strip out the custom avatar feature altogether. And our troubles with online were not over. MPlayer was indeed late, and they delayed the network adapter to spring, even though the pack-in disc and frequency ship dates were still looking good for November. Shu approached me and had asked if we could both ship for Christmas and still support the network adapter launch next spring. I pitched the idea to Aran and Alex, and they came back with a plan to do a disc swap, something that hadn't really been done since PlayStation 1 because the DVDs on a PS2 held so much more data than CDs. But their plan actually worked. We stripped out the network code in the original frequency disc, and then we shipped it on time at Christmas. And then we put a network-enabled version of a 4-song multiplayer demo on the pack-in disc. That demo had a disc swap option to put in the frequency disc as a data source so that you can play all the songs online. Genius. Anyway, both discs and adapters shipped in US and Europe. Sales were better than what other games had done, but they were not what we hoped. Games left shelves, especially where we marketed it at clubs, but reorders just didn't come. Even the Sony store in San Francisco only carried frequency for a few weeks. We did little more than break even. Despite lackluster sales, we got approved to do the sequel, called Amplitude, but it was on a strict budget, and it had to solve some of its approachability problems. While we didn't have the budget to launch a guitar controller, we could make other changes. We took the player out of the tunnel, and we put them on some sort of road with a vehicle. We made all tracks playable on easy and stopped booing when players lost. We improved the graphics and went away from the cell shading retro vibe. We also had the prestige now to sign a whole lot of new acts. Unfortunately, while negotiations completed and contracts were signed with Harmonix for the sequel, Sony shelved its plans for an online service to wait for the PS3. This ultimately cost me my job. Amplitude shipped with its music director, Chuck Dowd, as its producer. Its sales were not much better. The next year, Harmonix pursued a third-party publishing deal with Red Octane, a peripheral manufacturer, to solve the game's approachability problem by putting a guitar controller in players' hands. You all must know how that turned out. Then Frequency and Amplitude, which proved out the game mechanics but didn't have the controller, drifted into the category of cult classic. For me, it was truly a surprise and honor to be a part of that history. Thank you for playing.